Please welcome Matt Jarosz and Jonathon Monson. Today, they will showcase premiering content in their session, How to Solve Any Problem in 5 Minutes. Please stick around after Matt and Jonathon's session for a live Q&A.
Hi, everyone. We have all had to solve problems. We've all had to work with others to create solutions to those problems. And we've all had to fix the errors that we make using the wrong solution or solving the wrong problem. Given an hour to solve a problem, Einstein famously said that he would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem itself and only 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Most people flip that, working to solve a problem that they haven't defined well, leading to reactivity, scope creep, yet missed requirements, and missed deadlines, but still being over budget somehow. We're going to talk about how to approach your 55 minutes so that you can ensure you can solve your problem in 5. My name is Jonathon Monson. I'm an organizational change management lead with Stone Ridge Software. I really focus on the people side of change.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Jarosz. I'm a senior project manager for Stone Ridge Software for the CE delivery team. So today we're going to get into an agenda where 2 parts. We begin with envisioning and preparing in order to be successful later in an engagement or project. And then we're going to apply our envisioned objectives to the planning, developing, delivering, and maintaining phases of an engagement.
I want to thank DynamicsCon for welcoming us. We're excited to talk about this content and very much excited to engage with you after. So as we're going, feel free to drop in the chat any questions, comments, or thoughts you have, and we'll follow up with that. To kick us off, I want to think a little bit about how to define the problem. To really understand a problem, it's helpful to understand its opposite, which I would say is not the solution. The opposite of a problem is not a solution, rather, it's sort of what the problem is a shadow of, so to speak. So how do we think of a future state in which the problem is solved? In other words, how do we start defining the problem by envisioning success? And what counts as success? I would welcome you to drop in the chat what you first think of when you think of success on your projects. I know for me and for many people I've worked with, the first things we think of is that we're delivering a solution on time, we're sticking within a budget, and we're completing the scope as it was laid out for us. And I would agree, those are core components of success, but I might call that an installation for the sake of the discussion today. If you meet time, budget, and scope, you may be able to successfully install a system or deploy a solution. But I want to push us to consider success a little bit more robustly or more holistically. What are the business objectives that we're striving to meet? And what are the human objectives that we're striving to meet? I would say that maybe we consider this in implementation for the sake of the discussion. How do you fully understand what those objectives are before you start trying to solution? And I think this question can really be asked at any level of change, whether you're thinking about putting a field on a form, or if you're thinking about installing a full system that team or group didn't have before. And one conversation might take 2 minutes and the other might take 2 months, but nevertheless, this exercise is still important. How do you align what those objectives are so that we're all working toward the same outcome? And what does success actually look like? So as we think about this more holistic understanding of success, how do we articulate that? And this is with the aim of aligning all of the leaders, the stakeholders that are in play, and to validate when we've reached it. But there's also expectations that exist in people's minds that even if these are all benefits and these are all positive aspects of it, sometimes they're at odds or the priorities are misaligned. And we assume that, well, surely everyone wants the same thing that I want, but that doesn't necessarily hold true. And so we want to intentionally define the problem or the opportunity or the benefits to help guide everything else that flows after. One example of how to do this that is maybe understood by a lot of people is an exercise like the 5 whys. 5 whys is an approach to root cause analysis, where you identify a problem and you ask, okay, why did that problem happen? And then you ask, and why did that happen? And why did that happen? And why did that happen? And so on. It feels a little bit like a toddler perhaps asking these questions, but nevertheless, it gets to that root cause. For example, I hear a problem like, we have bad reports. Okay, so why do you have bad reports? Well, because we have bad data. Okay, why is the data bad? Well, because we have bad user inputs. And oftentimes as a change manager, people say, well, this is a training issue. You need to train them better. Or you need to redo training on this. And I say, maybe that could be true. But real example, is it because there's a state field on a form that's an open line of text instead of a dropdown? We can configure the system differently, right? So that's an example of the 5 whys as root cause. Just like asking, why is this happening? We can similarly ask, why is this important? And go through the same exercise. So the same example, we have bad reporting. Okay, instead of asking, why do you have bad reporting? Maybe we ask, why is reporting important? And we start going toward this desired outcome, start moving toward the vision. And I'll note, you don't want to say that if someone comes up to you and they're frustrated and they're saying, we've got really bad reporting. You say, well, why is reporting important? That's going to obviously lead to some frustration. So you want to make sure that you're explicitly aligning the intention of the conversations, the intention of the exercise before doing it. Sometimes they need empathy, sometimes they need solutions. I'm encouraging you to be intentional with a process for how to approach talking about the vision to most robustly provide a solution, but you do need to set those expectations up front. One way to very clearly set aside time for and an activity to do that is this templatized activity that I'm sharing now called abstraction laddering. I'm showing you a version of it that would be done on something like a virtual whiteboard. And what's beneficial about a virtual whiteboard is you bring in a lot of different stakeholders. They can all have access to the same whiteboard. And you have them participating and providing their input, which surfaces some of those assumptions, gets alignment from everybody involved, and you can talk through and hash out some of the questions or expectations or potential misalignments. For example, I'm working with one team that is installing Omnichannel for their technical support team. So using this template, I might put in the challenge section, why are you implementing Omnichannel? And typically when I ask that question, I'll receive some sort of pretty simple response as people are warming up. Something like, well, we need to update our technology. Okay, why do you need to update your technology? What's driving that, or what outcome do you need? Well, what's really driving it is this customer growth. We're seeing a lot of customer growth, and that's strategic as well. We're aiming to continue to grow that customer base. And then maybe another leader will jump in and say, and realistically, the processes just take too long. And you'll see I've shifted between going up one ladder to a new ladder. I suspect that there's going to be slightly different outcomes from that conversation as I push along that one. But maybe another leader jumps in after they hear that and they say something like, we've got a ton of rework, our processes aren't efficient and we have to redo them constantly. So I ask, well, why are you seeing this rework? And they'll note something like, well, we get a lot of frustrated customers calling in. They feel like they're not understood or the problem wasn't actually solved after they got off the phone. And say, okay, that's why they're leading to this case ownership philosophy. Oh, okay, so now we've surfaced what could become a pretty important component of how we develop Omnichannel and certainly how we approach enabling end users. And so there's 3 different ladders in the term of abstraction laddering, or sort of threads or veins of this conversation. And what I would do as I continue the conversation is push to the benefits, the outcomes, the vision that I'm hoping to see within these 3. 3 is an arbitrary number. You can use whatever you'd like. But what I would start to see is, maybe this is pushing towards scalability. We're seeing growth. We really need to envision a system that can perform at a level that can support that growth. Similarly, we're driving toward maybe efficiency, and this could be efficiency in terms of the service level agreements that we have with our customers. This could be the number of manual touch points or people that are interacting with a process. And scalability and efficiency are obviously closely connected, but they are distinct, and some of the expectations that can flow from those can be quite different as well. And then that last piece is actually sort of pushing towards something like personal connection. And so we have these 3 components of what a vision would look like for the future state, and noting that something like personal connection and efficiency are oftentimes at odds. When I'm thinking of making a personal connection, I'm not usually thinking, how efficiently can I get through that personal connection, right? And so these are potentially at odds, but nevertheless part of the same holistic vision. And I would say, again, this exercise, I've shown you very briefly, is completely scalable. I would do this for a full Dynamics 365 implementation from nothing, or for the role of a currently existing system that you just need better adoption, or even briefly adding a field to a form. Though, depending on the size of the conversation and number of stakeholders, you might take an approach more like an informal conversation using the 5 whys, or you might use a more robust session that's focused on a whiteboard with an activity like this. Either way, the outcomes are aiming to help guide the scope, clarify the impact, or define acceptance criteria even. And ideally, this is done before a project starts, but it can really take place at any time throughout the project. Obviously, before go live is ideal, but you want it to help guide. And as we'll see, you can start to use this for a variety of other outcomes as well. Once we've talked about and aligned to that why, the goal is to make it measurable. How will we know we've realized the benefits we're hoping to achieve? How will we know that we're actually getting the ROI that we want out of this project? And ideally, we're identifying maybe key results from these objectives, if you want to think of it as OKRs, or key performance indicators that we've identified that are related to this success criteria. And I'll show you an exercise similarly to the abstraction laddering that we can use to align people to this. So again, in something like a virtual whiteboard, though obviously you could do this kind of anywhere, the idea is we're trying to take certain components of the vision that we've called out along the left-hand side as the row headers, and then align that to certain metrics. In this case, I've called it out as the column headers for operational metrics, client metrics, employee metrics, or other. And at the intersection of each row with a column, I'm trying to identify what benefits or KPIs or other quantitative or qualitative metrics I want to use to justify that. For instance, within scalable, let's say, the scalability might be the first component of the vision we want to talk about. What does that mean in terms of the operational metrics? Are we talking about cost? Are we talking about the equivalent of a full-time employee? Is it system performance? Or perhaps it's the average handle time stays the same. You already know that. Maybe it's a baseline KPI you have, but the cases closed per day starts to increase. And interestingly, that starts to bleed over to the efficiency a little bit. Is efficiency in terms of that average handle time, or perhaps it's in terms of number of processes that you actually have, manual touch points, people that are involved in some of these processes. There's a lot of ways to think about efficiency, and that's just operationally. From a client perspective, is efficiency the service level agreement? From an employee metric perspective, do we have queues that they're expected to close each day or a certain number of cases, right? There are a lot of ways to then start to flesh out what does success actually look like. And even something like personal connection, when we start to think about that as a component of the vision, is this coming out in customer surveys? Is there a current state for the customer surveys, or is that something we need to bring into scope or find some way to hear back from our customers? And is there an employee satisfaction component to that under the employee metrics, or other components of ways to validate that we're achieving these components of success? Once we've gone through and identified the why, identified the KPIs that will validate we've gotten there or not, we can start to use some of that content to make it meaningful. Acting on it and sharing it and socializing it will help bring people along. And so using this for communications, using it for training and validating outcomes, or to that end, performance management, bringing in some of these KPIs into maybe one-on-ones between a manager and their employee that shows, hey, this is a key metric for their role, and that rolls into these business outcomes, which aligns to these success criteria. The vision and the success criteria can be used for that employee side, but can also be used for the project team itself. So is this helping to guide some of the elicitation of requirements for the project, or help with backlog refinement and prioritization to keep aligned that technical side with the business side? Or similarly, I've seen success criteria used as tags on things like epics or features. I've also seen it used directly for the acceptance criteria, depending on the level at which you're going through these exercises. Similarly, using it on retros to guide scope creep or talk about if we're still making progress toward that North Star. At the end of the day, the vision and the success criteria are valuable for guiding the project, but only if you actually use them. So think about how you can use those to guide not only the output of the project, the long-term goal, but also as an input into your preparation.
So let's segue into preparing for success. And I'd like to echo a few things that Jonathan said. One in particular is to be intentional about your processes. So let's pair the preparation and visioning portion with a tool that can be used to help you define your processes for your engagement and your projects. And the tool that I'd like to suggest is called SIPOC. SIPOC stands for suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. It's a tool to visually show a tool to show your process broken down into its components. It originated in about the 1980s out of the total quality movement, and it can be leveraged to develop new business processes, or it can be used to demonstrate existing processes to, say, a new team member. This is an example of a boilerplate SIPOC template, and there's a couple things I'd like you to know about this. You can see that each column represents one of the acronym letters, the suppliers, inputs, process, outputs, and customers. Each category here, so suppliers holistically pertains to this process, and the inputs holistically pertain to this process, and the outputs holistically, all of them collectively pertain to this one process. What I'd like to encourage you not to do is to think of this as a job aid or a procedure document. We're not looking for traceability left to right within each row. Each category is collectively and holistically meant to contribute to the entire process. And we're going to show you some examples here. A recommended approach to completing this document would be start with the processes. And again, this document is not a procedure document, so we're not looking to elicit every single minute step within a procedure process. We're looking to achieve collective understanding amongst the group that's participating using this document to understand, okay, we're talking about this process or that process. And so starting with the process, you can list the high-level steps, perhaps 4 to 8 steps that outline and bring everybody into the fold about the current process that we're discussing. You would then proceed to describe the outputs. And this is where you would start to pair the meaningful outputs of your envisioning. So we envisioned X, and these outputs that we're brainstorming are how we're going to achieve X, or will put us on a path to achieve the business objective. The customer section would be the next one that I would complete. And you can think of that as consumers. It could be anyone from management to another process to various team members. And then I would jump back to the fourth input here, which is inputs. And this directly ties to the outputs. And what I'd like you to imagine is that this section creates value when you think of how are these inputs going to achieve these outputs, not rather what are the things that we have to do just to get the steps done in the process. And then of course, the fifth section would be the suppliers or enablers you could think of, those that help support the inputs happening. And that could be anything from a person to another process to a organizational asset. So let's move to the next slide. And the first example that we're going to use is brush your teeth. And I hope that everybody has familiarity with this process. And so at a high level, let's think of some things that could be high level steps for brushing your teeth. And so you might think of things such as place toothpaste on the toothbrush, put water on the toothbrush, brush your teeth, spit out the toothpaste, rinse with water. And that would segue into your outputs. You would achieve clean gums and teeth, fresh breath, maybe a sense of accomplishment. And the receivers of those outputs, or the customers, would be you, the people around you who would no doubt appreciate your fresh breath, and perhaps your dentist. The inputs being a toothbrush, toothpaste, water, knowledge of how to brush your teeth. Your suppliers of that would say be a store or your dentist. So to come full circle, you've envisioned something, perhaps in a conversation or visit to your dentist, who said, you really need to clean up your routine in order to have clean gums and teeth. And therefore you achieved or envisioned these outputs, these objectives that are tied into these outputs, and how to enable yourself to get to those. Let's go to another example. Build a knowledge article. So this is something that many people will be familiar with in the D365 space. And so as a reminder, this is not a procedure document per se. We're simply outlining high-level process steps to ensure that all of us understand the process we're discussing. So you might go to the customer service hub. You would go to the article template section. You would select new and select your language. You'd enter whatever template information you desire to enter, and you'd click save. And the outputs of this, remember, tying into a business objective, could be a consumable knowledge article and experience of creating knowledge articles. And then no doubt your customers or consumers, users of the outputs would be perhaps a customer service rep, team leads, management, perhaps. Now, what do you do to achieve these outputs, not just fulfill the steps of the process? You might need knowledge of how to create a knowledge article. And you would no doubt need content for that knowledge article. The enablers, the supporters, the suppliers of the inputs are folks like subject matter experts for writing the knowledge article, maybe a procedure document for writing a knowledge article, and perhaps business process owners for supplying content for that template. And finally, let's go to a third example. So preparing a kickoff call, you might envision that you're going to need to create some sort of required pre-work for the kickoff call. You would likely know that you would need to create some sort of meeting content. You would need to gather your people for the call. You would need to have the actual kickoff call. And then there would be a call to action for next steps at the end of the kickoff call. And the outputs that would tie directly into your envisioned business objectives for the engagement or the project could be a team that has knowledge of the objectives, a team that has the tools to do their job, a team that has awareness of the immediate next steps, and a team that's fully prepared to achieve X, your business objective. The outputs for that could be, of course, your team, management, perhaps strategic partners that have participated in the kickoff call or benefit from the kickoff call. Your inputs in order to achieve those outputs would be your clear business objectives that have been envisioned, given the exercises that Jonathon showed you in the earlier slides, perhaps a necessary tool or tools to achieve the desired work, and appropriately skilled team members. And management and subject matter experts perhaps could be your enablers, your supporters, your suppliers.
So if you have spent your 55 minutes thinking about the problem well, you'll be ready to solve the problem, right? What do we think about from an organizational change management perspective and from a project management perspective as we approach implementation? how do we actually implement? The first step, I would say, is planning, which might seem odd given that we just talked about how to envision and prepare. But at the end of the day, from a change management perspective, we have gone through and talked about at a strategic level what needs to happen, what is the long-term plan, and how will we know we've arrived. We might have gone through some risk assessment, stakeholder analysis, things like that, that would help flesh out that strategy. But at this point, we want to make sure that we are actually translating the strategy into tactics so that we can actually act on the implications of that strategy. Because at the end of the day, we want to be able to answer the question from a people side, who is doing what, when, and with whom?
And from a delivery perspective or a project management perspective, some things that you might consider in the plan phase is that this is where you build your processes for a project or an engagement. So this is where you will engage with your subject matter experts. This is where you'll tie envisioned objectives to each process that you build. This is where you'll ask yourself how the outcomes of your processes support those objectives. And this is where you'll progressively elaborate. Planning is not a one-time event, a one-time meeting. You need to iterate on planning several times in order to get a full plan.
After and of course during planning, at some point you have to start developing. At the end of the day, we are trying to develop a system or a solution one way or another. From a change management perspective, as I said, I'm focused on the people side. So how do we bring people along? You will have crafted that overall strategy. You will have identified the tactics that align to those strategy. Don't forget to act on that planning. This could be lightweight communications. This could be iterative training or knowledge transfer. Even who you choose to bring along in a retro or other check-ins will impact their ability to be prepared at go live for the change that's coming. And feel free to drop in the chat what you think of when you think about bringing people along. What has worked best for you? What and when you're delivering some of these activities really depends on what the change is and how you're approaching the change. For instance, if it's a long waterfall project, you can pretty easily build a change management plan that builds to this go live. If it's an agile project on the other side, you do have to be intentional about creating targeted change management activities that don't overwhelm people with the amount and frequency, because that can lead to change fatigue, but rather how do we use some of these strategic activities to lubricate the process and make the consistency of the change meaningful and effective. And even something like Power Platform, right? If we're considering how you're going to deploy or allow people in as citizen developers, when we're thinking about those items, it's not the launch of the app that becomes the change, though that is part of the change, but actually it starts much earlier. Development itself becomes the change if you're allowing new people in to take advantage of some of the low code opportunities. And there's a lot of other planning and a lot of other actions that are required to enable people for that early part of the change as well. Things like, what are you going to do about application lifecycle management or data loss prevention policies? How are you going to support the COE? How are you going to account for some of the other security or governance issues, all of which will impact who, how, and when you're delivering some of these change management activities. And it all deserves its own planning and its own consideration. At the end of the day, though, it is dependent on you acting on it. Plans are only effective if they're actually deployed, and things will change, they do shift, but nevertheless, plans are a helpful guidepost as we work through some of the project.
And to echo, plans are only effective if they're deployed. Additionally, plans are only effective if they've been created. And so in the previous phase, that's where you're doing your planning and you're building of those processes. And the develop phase is where you start to execute your plans and your processes. Some examples from a delivery and project management example could be to build and validate. This means you ensure traceability of what you're building against the requirements. Example processes could be things such as testing and validation as you go, perhaps demos with whoever you're collaborating with.
So after we've gone through and planned and developed, ideally, we're obviously working toward actually delivering whatever this solution is. And I like to consider a detailed go live checklist, just like many people on the project management, and that Matt will talk about in just a second, will do. And it's interesting to think about people and having these structured, articulated activities up to go live, but it's really quite true. And I think it's also helpful to align to the project-based milestones. There's a balance that we try to strike between transparency and bringing people along with not creating these grand expectations that may be disappointed if things don't go exactly as we expect. Because oftentimes timelines have to shift, or what's in scope for a first phase might shift as well. So how do we balance that? And one way to do that is to create plans that are aligned to the project management checklist or other project milestones. For instance, maybe you have a trigger at dev complete or UAT start or UAT end, go, no go, these kinds of milestones along the way that can trigger communications, that could trigger training opportunities, and that as you get closer and closer to go live, can be more and more finely attuned to what we're doing when and with whom, so that we know that users are ready once go live actually arrives. And a lot should be completed early on and throughout the process, right? That's how you bring people along. So communications for awareness, maybe periodic training or demos or previews, potentially some sort of feedback mechanism, surveys or interviews to account for the user readiness over time. Those are ideal ways to create the expectation of something changing, and then targeting the milestones for the content and what you're actually communicating helps align the development with the readiness of the change. And there are these activities going throughout the project. There are these more detailed, maybe activities going up to go live, and some of these bleed into after go live. So, have the final communications gone out is a great question, but have the specific resources been shared? If it's a document or training video or actual people, have they been prepared and shared for up to and after go live? How do we monitor, and do we have plans in place to triage bugs versus system performance issues versus human behavior issues? How will we know if it's a training concern, a development concern, or a system performance issue? And then to that end, what does user training and support look like up to go live, after go live, and in the life cycle? And I would also call out specifically this manager level for some of this enablement, because oftentimes the end users are thought of when we're talking about training or communications. And the leaders are obviously thought of when we're talking about envisioning and making these decisions. But there's this group of managers that oftentimes are expected to both go through the change and lead the change for their teams. How do we support them and be sensitive to their experience and making sure they have what they need to experience the change as people, but also to lead the change as key leaders within the organization? And as we're going through all of this, what are the expectations for performance of the individuals? And when will data be in the system to validate the success criteria, but similarly to hold accountable these users to the new state of things, to the new behaviors or the new expectations? And when will we have those KPIs, the key performance indicators, to validate all of those outcomes?
From a delivery perspective and project management perspective, this is where your intentionally designed processes come out in order to deliver your product. And as Jonathon said, it's not just a technical perspective, but also a user perspective. So you need to know and have a process that addresses what steps or inputs are you going to need to successfully deliver your software. In addition, you're going to have to need steps and inputs for a go live event that are needed for a successful delivery of software from the user perspective. And this can include processes and tools such as the go live checklist that we've mentioned, a process to validate and test software, a process to use in case something deployed fails, and perhaps a process to track issues after the go live event.
So obviously we've been talking a lot about everything pre-go live, but it's just as important to think about that after go live. How do we maintain or sustain the success we hopefully would have achieved at this point? And one comment that I think about is the transition to the life cycle. There are a lot of activities within that, but I think of it as a transition to life cycle to make sure that we are meaningfully shifting our focus, not just saying, hey, we flipped the switch and now we're successful, go back to business as usual. That is important. What does business as usual mean now that we are in the future state? That is a transition. It's not just a return to normal, rather it's a transition to normal. And there's an opportunity, of course, to validate the success criteria. So the first thing we want to do is make sure, hey, did we actually realize the benefits we were hoping to realize? And throughout that, how are we identifying if there's a gap to goal? How are we identifying what needs to happen from a training perspective? How do we do refresher training or gap training? How do we deploy reinforcement plans? The recognition of success, or even just the recognition and reward of effort, is an important piece to keeping up your team morale and keeping momentum through go live, not just at the finish line. And identifying those opportunities to drive accountability. So you're ensuring, of course, up to the go live and after that the training has happened. But then long term, do you have to update previous training material or reference material? Update onboarding plans for training, and of course, other things like giving users security roles and access to the things that they actually need. And then defining that type of monitoring and what is happening during that transition and how long will it last. There's something, up to go live that'll be defined, usually some sort of hypercare period. And then that shifts into the life cycle. And hopefully it does shift intentionally into life cycle, not just sort of fall off. Or if you're iterating for next phases, what needs to happen and who's supporting, right? Sometimes the project team stays on and they are now life cycle production support, but oftentimes they start going into the next phase. And if the project team should not be the production support, is there a support desk handoff? And has that been defined and the requisite knowledge transfer happening? Similarly, on the user side, how do we follow through on accountability? Ensure that those expectations were communicated and the training and support offered, but also ensure that leaders are actually managing to those expectations. And that accountability is driven in things like one-on-ones or similar. At the end of the day, expectations without accountability are hopes, and hope is not a strategy.
From the project management perspective, we've delivered our product. Our product is live at this point in the engagement and project. And the work of the delivery team becomes more about knowledge and training, transitioning to a sustainable BAU framework or business as usual framework, something that's life cycle every day, that's normal. And it's about continuous improvement for both the users and the project team. So it's important to think back on your projects and create a process where you'll review the engagement and evaluate your processes. How well did your processes assist with meeting your business objectives? How well did those processes, tie into user expectations as well? What changes would you make in your processes on the next engagement? What lessons have you learned?
If you've spent your 55 minutes thinking about the problem well, these focused, intentional activities we've called out to follow through should be effective. At the end of the day, I, from a change management perspective, really want to emphasize the importance of gathering your people. We've been talking about defining the problem, but if you do that in a vacuum, you might as well go straight to solutioning. People are a massive strength, and bringing in different views, different perspectives, different knowledge and experience absolutely drives the benefit of the outcome. Your people are the key resource in that sense, but there are loads of other resources that you can reference and gather as well.
From a delivery perspective, if you're curious about how to design processes and you're struggling to come up with the outputs and the inputs, my advice is to seek an expert. So you will often need expert input on your projects, and this may seem daunting when you feel you don't have this expertise. places to find experts. How great is it that we have this amazing Dynamics user group community and this forum of DynamicsCon Virtual? This is exactly the type of place where you might seek out those experts. This community alone has many experts on the D365 products and how to prepare for an engagement. If you're seeking expert input, I'd recommend leveraging this community. We'd like to thank Dynamics User Group and the DynamicsCon Virtual and this community. My name is Matt Jarosz. I'm a Senior Project Manager from Stone Ridge Software.
And I'm Jonathon, Monson, Organizational Change Management Lead. We've included some contact information and QR codes to our LinkedIns if you're interested in connecting. We're more than happy to. Thanks again to DynamicsCon, and thank you to all of you. We're certainly looking forward to following up on the chat and opening it up for a Q&A.
Thanks very much.